The Everyday Life of Abraham Lincoln by Francis Fisher Browne. Chapter 19a. Lincoln's personal attention to the military problems of the war, efforts to push forward the war, disheartening delays, Lincoln's worry and perplexity, brightening prospects, Union victories in North Carolina and Tennessee, proclamation by the President, Lincoln wants to see for himself, visits Fortress Monroe. Early in 1862, Lincoln began giving more of his personal attention to military affairs. He was dissatisfied with the slow movements and small achievements of our armies, and sought to infuse new zeal and energy into the Union commanders. He also began a careful study of the great military problems pressing for solution, and he seemed resolved to assume the full responsibilities of his position, not only as the civil head of the government, but as the commander-in-chief of the armies and navies of the United States. In this he was influenced by no desire for personal control of the commanders in the field or interference with their plans. He always preferred to leave them the fullest liberty of action, but he felt that the situation demanded a single head, ready and able to take full responsibility for the most important steps, and, true to himself and his habits of a lifetime, he neither sought responsibility nor flinched from it. The leading officers of the Union army were mostly young and inexperienced men, and none of them had as yet demonstrated the capacity of a great commander. At best it was a process of experiment, to see what generals and what strategic movements were most likely to succeed. In order to be able to judge correctly of measures and men, Lincoln undertook to familiarize himself with the practical details of military affairs and operations. Here was developed a new and unsuspected phase of his character. The plain country lawyer, unversed in the art of war, was suddenly transformed into the great civil ruler and military chieftain. He was already, says Mr. A.G. Riddle, one of the wariest, coolest, and most skillful managers of men. A born strategist, he was now rapidly mastering the great outline ideas of the art of war. The elements of selfishness and ferocity which are not unusual with first-class military chiefs, said General Keyes, a prominent officer of the Union army, were wholly foreign to Lincoln's nature. Nevertheless, there was not one of his most trusted warlike counselors in the beginning of the war who equaled him in military sagacity. His reliance in the new duties and perils that confronted him was upon his simple common sense, his native power of judgment and discernment. Military science, says a distinguished officer, is common sense applied to the affairs of war. While Lincoln made no claim to technical knowledge in this sphere, and preferred to leave details to his subordinates, he yet developed an insight into military problems and an understanding of practical operations in the field, which enabled him not only to approve or disapprove judiciously, but to direct and plan. A striking confirmation of this is given by Mr. J.M. Winchell, who thus relates what happened in a personal interview with the President. I was accompanied by one of Mr. Lincoln's personal friends, and when we entered the well-known reception-room, a very tall, lanky man came quickly forward to meet us. His manner seemed to me the perfection of courtesy. I was struck with the simplicity, kindness, and dignity of his deportment, so different from the clownish manners with which it was then customary to invest him. His face was a pleasant surprise, formed as my expectations had been from the poor photographs then in vogue, and the general belief in his ugliness. I remember thinking how much better looking he was than I had anticipated, and wondering that anyone should consider him ugly. His expression was grave and careworn, but still enlivened with a cheerfulness that gave me instant hope. After a brief interchange of commonplaces, he entered on a description of the movements and the general strategical purposes which should govern them both. Taking from the wall a large map of the United States, and laying it on the table, he pointed out with his long finger the geographical features of the vicinity, clearly describing the various movements so far as known, reasoning rigidly from step to step, and creating a chain of probabilities too strong for serious dispute. His apparent knowledge of military science, and his familiarity with the special features of the present campaign, were surprising in a man who had been all his life a civilian, engrossed with politics and the practice of the law, and whose attention must necessarily be so much occupied with the perplexing detail of duties incident to his position. It was clear that he made the various campaigns of the war a subject of profound and intelligent study, forming opinions thereon as positive and clear as those he held in regard to civil affairs. Toward the end of January, 1862, Lincoln sought to overcome the inertia that seemed to be settling upon the Union forces by issuing the President's General Order No. 1, directing that on the 22nd day of February following, a general movement of the land and naval forces of the United States be made against the insurgent forces, and giving warning that the heads of the departments, and especially the Secretaries of War and of the Navy, with all their subordinates, and the General-in-Chief, with all other commanders and subordinates of land and naval forces, will severally be held to their strict and full responsibilities for prompt execution of this order. This order, while it doubtless served to infuse activity into commanders and officials, did not result in any substantial successes to our arms. The President, worn by his ceaseless activities and anxieties, seems to have been momentarily disheartened at the situation. Admiral Dahlgren, who was in command of the Washington Navy Yard in 1862, narrates that one day at this period the President drove down to see the 150-pounder cannon fired. For the first time I heard the President speak of the bare possibility of our being two nations, as if alluding to a previous suggestion. He could not see how the two could exist so near each other. He was evidently much worried at our lack of military success, and remarked that no one seemed ready. It is difficult to portray the worry and perplexity that beset Lincoln's life, and the incessant demands upon his attention, in his efforts to familiarize himself, as he felt compelled to do, with the practical operations of the war. Admiral Dahlgren, who saw him almost daily, relates that one morning the President sent for him and said, "Well, Captain, here's a letter about some new powder." He read the letter and showed the sample of powder, adding that he had burned some of it, and it did not seem a good article. There was too much residuum. "Now, I'll show you," said he. So he got a small sheet of paper and placed some of the powder on it, then went to the fire and with the tongs picked up a coal, which he blew with his spectacles still on his nose. Then he clapped the coal to the powder, and after the explosion remarked, "There is too much left there." There is something almost grotesque, but touching and pathetic as well, in this picture of the President of the United States, with all his enormous cares and responsibilities, engaged in so petty a matter as testing a sample of powder, and yet so great was his anxiety for the success of the armies and navies under his control, that he wished to become personally satisfied as to every detail. He did not wish our armies or our war vessels to lose battles on account of bad powder. At another time, Admiral Dahlgren has related, the President sent for me regarding some new invention. After the agent of the inventor left, the President began on army matters. "Now," said he, "I am to have a sweat of 5 or 6 days," alluding to an impending battle, for the result of which he was very anxious. Again, "The President sent for me. Some man in trouble about arms. President holding a breech loader in his hand. He asked me about the ironclads and Charleston." And again, "Went to the department and found the President there. He looks thin and is very nervous. Said they were doing nothing at Charleston, only asking for one ironclad after another. The canal at Vicksburg was of no account, and he wondered how any sensible man could favor it. He feared the favorable state of public expectation would pass away before anything was done. Then he leveled a couple of jokes at the doings at Vicksburg and Charleston." No wonder the sympathetic Dahlgren, witnessing the sufferings of the tortured President, should exclaim, "Poor gentleman! How thin and wasted he is!" The gloomy outlook in the spring of 1862 was relieved by the substantial victories of General Burnside in North Carolina and of General Grant in Tennessee. The President was cheered and elated by these successes. It is related that General Burnside, visiting Washington at this time, called on the President, and that the meeting was a grand spectacle. The two stalwart men rushed into each other's arms and warmly clasped each other for some minutes. When General Burnside was about to leave, the President inquired, "Is there anything, my dear General, that I can do for you?" "Yes, yes," was the quick reply, "and I am glad you asked me that question. My 3 brigadiers, you know. Everything depended on them, and they did their duty grandly. Oh, Mr. President, we owe so much to them. I should so much like, when I go back, to take them their promotions." "It shall be done," was Lincoln's hearty response. And on the instant the promotions were ordered, and General Burnside had the pleasure of taking back with him to Foster, Reno, and Parke their commissions as major generals. Our brightening prospects impelled the President to issue on the 10th of April the following proclamation, breathing his deeply religious spirit: "It has pleased Almighty God to vouchsafe signal victories to the land and naval forces engaged in suppressing an internal rebellion, and at the same time to avert from our country the dangers of foreign intervention and invasion. It is therefore recommended to the people of the United States that at their next weekly assemblages in their accustomed places of public worship, which shall occur after the notice of this proclamation shall have been received, they especially acknowledge and render thanks to our Heavenly Father for these inestimable blessings, that they then and there implore spiritual consolation in behalf of all those who have been brought into affliction by the casualties and calamities of sedition and civil war, and that they reverently invoke the divine guidance for our national councils, to the end that they may speedily result in the restoration of peace, harmony, and unity throughout our borders, and hasten the establishment of fraternal relations among all the countries of the earth." Abraham Lincoln. Early in May the President determined on a personal visit to Fortress Monroe, in order to learn what he could from his own observation of affairs in that region. The trip was a welcome respite from the cares and burdens of official life, and he gave himself up, as far as he could, to its enjoyment. The Secretary of War, Stanton, and the Secretary of the Treasury, Chase, accompanied the President. A most interesting account of the expedition is given by General Viele, who was a member of the party and thus had an opportunity to observe Lincoln closely. "When on the afternoon of May 4th," says General Viele, "I was requested by the Secretary of War to meet him within an hour at the Navy Yard, with the somewhat mysterious caution to speak to no one of my movements, I had no conception whatever of the purpose or intention of the meeting. It was quite dark when I arrived there simultaneously with the Secretary, who led the way to the wharf on the Potomac, to which a steamer was moored that proved to be a revenue cutter, the Miami. We went on board, and proceeded at once to the cabin, where to my surprise I found the President and Mr. Chase, who had preceded us. The vessel immediately got under way and steamed down the Potomac. After supper the table was cleared, and the remainder of the evening was spent in a general review of the situation, which lasted long into the night. The positions of the different armies in the field, the last reports from their several commanders, the probabilities and possibilities as they appeared to each member of the group, together with many other topics, relevant and irrelevant, were discussed, interspersed with the usual number of anecdotes from the never-failing supply with which the President's mind was stored.